Mission Control, Houston. The room is dead silent. Dozens of the world's most brilliant engineers stare unblinking at their monitors. Nobody is speaking. Nobody is moving. The only sound is the sterile hum of the air conditioning and the rapid beating of their own hearts. Hundreds of miles above the Pacific Ocean, the Artemis II Orion capsule is slamming into the Earth's atmosphere at a staggering 25,000 miles per hour. Inside that capsule are 4 human beings. As the spacecraft violently collides with the atmosphere, the friction instantly generates a bubble of superheated plasma around the hull. The temperature outside the window spikes to nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, half the temperature of the surface of the sun. At this exact moment, all communications are cut off. The plasma blackout has begun. For the next several minutes, Houston is completely blind. The engineers staring at the blank screens share a terrifying, unspoken secret. They know something the general public does not. They know that the only thing standing between those 4 astronauts and instant incineration is a heat shield. And they know that the heat shield is fundamentally flawed. Welcome to the darkest gamble of the modern space age. This is the story of how NASA made the impossible decision to send 4 humans to the moon, knowing perfectly well that the armor meant to bring them home was broken. If you appreciate deep dives into the hidden truths of human spaceflight, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support allows us to continue investigating these classified case files. The terrifying truth behind the Artemis program awaits you inside the vault. To understand the terrifying stakes of Artemis II, we must first go back and look at the mission that preceded it, a mission that was presented to the world as an absolute, flawless triumph. On December 11th, 2022, the Artemis I mission came to an end. It was an uncrewed test flight, a vital rehearsal to ensure that the Space Launch System rocket and the Orion crew capsule were ready to carry human life. For 25 days, the empty capsule traveled beyond the moon and back, transmitting breathtaking high-definition video of the lunar surface back to Earth. When the Orion capsule finally splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, it was hailed as a monumental victory. NASA executives gave press conferences declaring the mission a resounding success, paving the way for the return of humanity to the lunar surface. But behind closed doors, the celebration abruptly stopped the moment the capsule was pulled out of the water. When recovery divers and engineers got their first close look at the bottom of the Orion spacecraft, their blood ran cold. The heat shield, the single most critical piece of survival hardware on the entire vehicle, was severely damaged. And it was not the kind of damage they had predicted. In aerospace engineering, heat shields are designed to melt. They use a process called ablation. The Orion capsule is coated in a specialized material known as AvCoat, a sophisticated epoxy resin filled with silica fibers originally developed during the Apollo era. As the spacecraft hits the atmosphere and reaches thousands of degrees, this AvCoat material is supposed to slowly burn and vaporize, safely carrying the immense thermal energy away from the titanium skeleton of the ship. Engineers expected the shield to come back looking like a smoothly charred marshmallow. Instead, it came back looking like it had been chewed apart by a giant machine. Chunks of the protective material had violently broken off. There were deep divots, gouges, and terrifying craters scattered across the surface. In over 100 different locations, the ablative material had completely chipped away, exposing the layers beneath. Even worse, the massive metal bolts holding the shield together had partially melted through. If there had been human beings inside Artemis I, the unpredictable airflow caused by those missing chunks of heat shield could have created localized hotspots. A hotspot at 5,000 degrees doesn't just damage a spacecraft. It burns right through the hull in a matter of milliseconds, vaporizing the crew instantly. NASA had a massive, potentially catastrophic problem on their hands. But instead of grounding the program immediately, they chose to keep the details buried deep within technical reports. The public continued to cheer for the success of Artemis, completely unaware that the armor meant to protect the next crew had just failed its most critical test. What exactly went wrong? How does a multi-billion-dollar space agency with decades of experience in atmospheric re-entry build a heat shield that blows chunks in the middle of the sky? The answer lies in the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. After months of silent, frantic testing in laboratories across the country, NASA engineers discovered the root cause of the spalling. When the AVCoat material was heated to extreme temperatures during the Artemis I re-entry, the chemical reactions inside the epoxy created gases. Under normal circumstances, this gas is supposed to permeate through the outer charred layer and safely vent into the atmosphere. But the Artemis I heat shield was too rigid. It was not sufficiently permeable. As the capsule skipped across the Earth's atmosphere to slow down, a maneuver similar to skipping a stone across a pond, the thermal energy soaked deep into the shield. Gases rapidly accumulated beneath the surface with no way to escape. The internal pressure built up to critical levels until finally, the heat shield essentially began to explode from the inside out. Pop, pop. Pieces of the protective layer were violently blown off by the trapped gas, creating the deep voids that horrified the recovery team. In the high-stakes world of space exploration, redundancy is a religion. A spacecraft has backup computers, backup oxygen tanks, and backup communication arrays. If one system fails, another immediately takes over. But there is no backup for a heat shield. You cannot carry a spare. It is a single point of failure. If the heat shield cracks, if it fails to repel the plasma, the crew dies. It is a terrifying binary equation. It either works perfectly or everyone on board perishes. By the spring of 2024, the internal secret could no longer be contained. The Office of the Inspector General, an independent oversight body, released a bombshell report that published the horrifying photographs of the chewed-up Artemis I heat shield for the world to see. The report made damning claims. It stated clearly that the heat shield spalling posed a critical threat to the safety of future crews. It outlined how the missing chunks could alter the hypersonic aerodynamics of the capsule, causing it to roll uncontrollably or burn through entirely. The reality was now out in the open. The AVCoat design in its current state was unpredictable. And yet, the Artemis II mission, crewed by 4 veteran astronauts, was already on the assembly line. NASA was now forced into the most agonizing dilemma of the 21st century. When a critical piece of life-saving hardware fails a test, the logical response is to redesign it, rebuild it, and test it again until it is perfect. But in the realm of modern aerospace engineering, logic is often held hostage by 2 immovable forces: time and money. Following the terrifying discoveries of Artemis I and the brutal exposure by the Office of the Inspector General, NASA found itself standing at an impossible crossroads. Option A was to completely redesign the AVCoat heat shield. This would mean physically dismantling the already fully assembled Artemis II Orion capsule. They would have to scrape off the existing shield, engineer a brand new permeable material, apply it, and subject it to years of rigorous vacuum and thermal testing. The cost? Hundreds of millions, if not billions, of taxpayer dollars. The timeline, it would delay the Artemis II crewed launch by a minimum of 3 to 4 years, pushing the mission to 2027 or perhaps even 2028. For the administration, a delay of that magnitude was not just an engineering setback. It was a geopolitical disaster. The reality of the 21st century is that space exploration is no longer just a scientific endeavor. It is the ultimate high ground of national security. And the United States is no longer racing against the Soviet Union. They are racing against a highly organized, heavily funded, and aggressively ambitious adversary, the Chinese National Space Administration. China has made their intentions crystal clear. They are aggressively targeting the lunar South Pole, a region believed to contain vast reserves of frozen water. In the harsh environment of space, water is not just for drinking. It can be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen to create rocket fuel. Whoever controls the lunar water essentially controls the ultimate gas station for deep space exploration and lunar colonization. China plans to put their own astronauts on the moon by 2030. If NASA halted the Artemis program to fix a heat shield, they risked surrendering the lunar South Pole to a rival superpower. The political pressure raining down on NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. was crushing. They simply could not afford to hit the brakes. So, NASA administrators turned to Option B. Option B was a concept known in the military and aerospace industries as acceptable risk. Teams of thermodynamic engineers and aerodynamic specialists worked around the clock, running massive supercomputer simulations. They fed the data from the chewed-up Artemis I shield into the computers, trying to mathematically predict exactly how, where, and when the shield would pop and fracture during the next flight. Their conclusion was a masterclass in calculated gambling. They determined that while they could not stop the heat shield from breaking apart, they could alter the way the spacecraft entered the atmosphere. By adjusting the trajectory and the angle of reentry, they believed they could reduce the thermal load just enough to prevent the chunks of missing avcoat from causing a fatal burn-through. They weren't fixing the shield. They were simply hoping they could manage the damage while it was happening in real time. In the spring of 2024, NASA made their final, controversial decision. They announced to the world that they would not be replacing the heat shield on the Artemis II capsule. They accepted the root cause of the spalling, and they accepted the risk. The 4 astronauts, Commander Reed Wiseman, pilot Victor Glover, mission specialist Christina Koch, and Canadian mission specialist Jeremy Hansen, were officially cleared to fly to the moon on a spacecraft wearing fractured armor. It was a decision that sent shockwaves through the veteran aerospace community. Former Apollo engineers, men who had calculated the margins of life and death in the 1960s, watched in uneasy silence. They knew the golden rule of spaceflight better than anyone. The atmosphere does not care about your computer simulations. The atmosphere only cares about physics. And physics was about to put those 4 astronauts through the most terrifying trial by fire in human history. We return now to that dead silent room in mission control. The Artemis II Orion capsule is no longer gliding through the frictionless vacuum of deep space. It has slammed into the upper layers of the Earth's atmosphere at Mach 32, 32 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, the air molecules cannot get out of the way fast enough. They are violently compressed, igniting into a blinding envelope of superheated plasma. Hitting the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour is not like flying through the air. It is like crashing into a brick wall made of solid fire. Inside the tiny cabin, Commander Reed Wiseman and his crew are violently pinned into their seats. The gravitational forces rapidly multiply, crushing their chests with up to 7 Gs of continuous pressure, making every single breath an agonizing struggle. Outside their small, reinforced windows, the universe has vanished, replaced by a swirling, blinding vortex of orange and purple plasma. The exterior temperature reaches a staggering 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, the radio cuts out. The density of the plasma shield completely blocks all electromagnetic signals. For several agonizing minutes, Houston is blind, and the 4 astronauts are utterly alone. But inside the capsule, the astronauts are not blind to the reality of their situation. These are veteran test pilots and engineers. They have read the unredacted reports from the Office of the Inspector General. They know exactly what the bottom of the Artemis I spacecraft looked like. They know that the mathematical models and supercomputer simulations are now colliding with the brutal, unforgiving laws of thermodynamics. To bleed off their immense speed, the Orion capsule executes a highly complex maneuver known as a skip reentry. It dips into the atmosphere, uses aerodynamic lift to skip back out into space, like a stone skipping across a pond, and then dives back in for the final descent. It is during these extreme temperature fluctuations that the avcoat material is tested to its absolute limit. Over the deafening continuous roar of the plasma tearing past the hull, the astronauts listen. They wait for the sound that the engineers warned them about. The muffled, violent pops echoing from the bottom of the spacecraft. The sound of the trapped gases exploding. The sound of their primary heat shield violently spalling and breaking apart in real time. They know that if the trajectory is even slightly off, or if a piece of avcoat chips away in the wrong location, the aerodynamic flow of the plasma will change. A localized hotspot will form. If that happens, there are no alarms. There is no time to react. The 5,000-degree fire will simply burn through the titanium skeleton of the capsule, and the 4 humans inside will be vaporized in a fraction of a millisecond. In Houston, the flight director stares at the massive digital clock on the wall, counting down the seconds of the blackout. This is the multi-billion-dollar gamble. This is the acceptable risk. If the math was wrong, the capsule will simply cease to exist, and the radio will remain silent forever. The seconds stretch into eternity. The silence in the control room is suffocating. Then, a faint crackle of static breaks through the speakers. Radar dishes in the Pacific Ocean detect a rapidly decelerating object dropping out of the sky. The static clears, and a human voice calls out from the Orion capsule. They have survived the plasma. Moments later, the massive drogue parachutes deploy, catching the dense ocean air and violently slowing the charred, battered capsule. When it finally splashes down into the Pacific waters, a collective, breathless cheer erupts inside Mission Control. The gamble paid off. The math held together just long enough to bring them home. But the terrifying reality of the Artemis program remains forever changed. The public will cheer for a flawless victory, but historians and aerospace engineers will look back at this moment with a profound sense of awe and unease. It proves that no matter how advanced our technology becomes, no matter how powerful our supercomputers are, the exploration of deep space is not a sterile science. It is a terrifying, brutal frontier. And it is ultimately driven not by perfect machines, but by the raw, undeniable courage of human beings who are willing to look death in the eye, strap themselves into a flawed spacecraft, and ride it straight into the fire. Now, we turn the investigation over to you. What are your thoughts on NASA's controversial decision? Do you believe that sending humans to the moon with a known defect in the heat shield is a necessary, acceptable risk in the new space race against China, or is it a reckless gamble with human life? We highly value your perspective, so please let us know.